What do we know about the people who will move? What do they think we need for a good life? Will they come from nearby and speak another language? Will they come from far away and speak our language? When will we become the ones who move? What will we bring with us? How will we greet one another? In the past, what has architecture offered those who move? What could architecture offer them in the future?
I wanted to talk about a studio that I'm teaching with my colleague Sumaya Valley. Sumaya is the principal of Counterspace and currently in Jeddah curating the first biennial of Islamic art. But together we teach a unit at the Royal College of Art in London called Hijra. Let me just share my screen. My students in the Hijra unit, our students, are today opening an exhibition. So this event is very well timed because our work is online and I can share it with you. ADS 11, which is the name of our studio at the Royal College of Art, travels with and travels the fringes of the word hijra, which is an Arabic word referring to emigrating, passing, or coming. The term hijra also speaks to the kinds of gathering one might find in preparation of a journey, in its midst, or in the line of flight, or indeed, if a destination exists, then at a destination. We think that architecture relies on a range of forms of expertise, from building codes to planning regulations, many of which have been discussed in previous presentations. Equally, it arises from diverse forces, desires, and projections. Architecture could be seen as one of the most enduring ways in which we tell stories about ourselves. But those stories in dominant discourse have tended to serve the confinement or control of space that has shaped historical experience. And so social relations are really thought about in static form. And so what we're asking our students to do is consider those who have arrived through an act of migration and its specific spatial experience, which is, these are conditions that are rarely acknowledged in most of what constitutes excellence, provocation, or experimentation in architecture. We've asked our students to celebrate a different kind of spatial politics. I mean, at this point, I should say that I am a product of migration, as many of us are. My parents were immigrants from India in the 70s. Prior to that, I suppose my ancestors would have migrated from mangrove areas in Bangladesh to India shortly after partition. And indeed, Sumaya's family also migrated from India to South Africa, where she is now based. So we carry within us a sense of lineage or continuity of a kind of migratory impact on contemporary life. So we're asking our students to channel that imaginative politics that is inherent to all groups of people and all ideas migrating in order to survive and thrive. We think that there's a lot of architectural potential in working with the diasporic, the mythical, the performative, and the narrative to create a new set of architectural conventions and to give material and spatial representation to these themes. Okay, so that was a video that we commissioned with also an architecture student who produces music, who is a product of migration from Sri Lanka. And so these are conditions that we're seeing in our student body, and we're trying to find ways to celebrate that. These are some of the works of our fantastic and beautiful and phenomenally interesting students. But you can check that out in links that I'll share later on. So that's kind of a discussion that I'm bringing, both in my personal history, but also in terms of what I've been discussing with my students. Gosh, it's been such an intense discussion. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to cast my mind all the way back to the quite concrete, no pun intended, example that Christoph and Venka gave us with the Lovo project. Okay, first of all, I mean, we've been thinking a lot about agency, specifically within, let's say, a traditional role of the architect. How much agency does that individual have? And indeed, how much agency does architecture have in terms of mitigating or even celebrating the impacts of migration? And agency is what I was struck with, Christoph and Wenke, in your project. I think you said it very simply at the beginning. We thought that this was an issue, and we lobbied to do it. How important was it in this project that you were the client builders? Because I think obviously that gives you the agency to determine your project. Do you think it would have been possible without you as the client builders?
Yeah, hello again. I probably answer this question. I think it was helpful for us because we could talk and think about the concept of the whole project. But with the second project that Wenke just briefly described, we are not the client. We are like the developing an idea, and we gave the picture to a client. So I think both is possible. Both are ways that are not. Many architects do. It's not our invention, but it's not our our core profession to start and try to develop ideas. And Wenke showed a bit about the mixing of the shape of the building in this new project. Well, the students, they know how much work it is if you change the layout in a house from one floor to the other. And so we did. We committed this work to ourselves. So it's not a project to make profit. It's a project to live on and to do what your beliefs are. This is probably a bit more than you were asking, Shumi, but I have to say it is very for us. It's a bit of a turning point, the Lovo project, because we are really thinking different about housing, not only when it comes to resources and climate change, but also what do we want to build? Why should we wait for a client to ask us to do something that we probably don't think is a good thing to do?
No, Christoph, that's exactly what I was asking about. I mean, especially, I think I'm speaking to you all from London, and in this country, we feel like the architecture profession is increasingly disempowered in terms of making those decisions about exactly how one wants to build. How one wants to practice and what the profession can provide is always up for discussion, but how one wants to build is incredibly regulated here. And so it's truly inspirational to hear you talk about this recognition, this turning point of intentionality and agency and really acting on it. So, it's a truly inspirational project. I guess a question to follow on from that would be, has there been any interest from other groups and to scale this model or to replicate it? And do you anticipate any problems with this?
Yeah, we have a lot of inquiries from students from all over the world, from you, but not from the government or from other people. This is really sad, I must say. And it's even so that in Berlin, they build now some refugee housings in a very bad style, and they do it without architects. Even we have especially in Berlin, a great potential of creative people, of architects, designers, and so artists, who want to be involved in a bigger scale, but we are not involved. We fight for it, but until now we have no result, unfortunately.
I suppose one kind of burning question that I would have if I was looking at this project, let's say in a publication, would be how does this model of intersectional support work? And how would one even go about measuring such a thing?
Mm.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I think I'm not an expert, of intersectional, but for me in person, I think as long as we have this discrimination from for people with intersectional identities, yeah, there is no other way maybe than to create a kind of safer space. And where shouldn't they live in a safer space? Yeah. So because there's a lot of discrimination when they go out, and all what we heard about it from the social workers, yeah, from this project, for instance, that it works quite good. Of course, you have problems, yeah, and you have more problems if the people are mentally ill a bit or not really stable, and there are some people in this house. And yeah, but I think in the best of the world, if we had no discrimination, then it would be very nice to mix all people up, of course, yeah, all people, all marginalized groups. But so as we have this discrimination, I think it's also good to protect them in a way.
I think it is something to be carefully modulated. I mean, our social system in the UK did mix a lot of vulnerable groups with not always positive outcomes, because I think you're right, none of us are experts in, you know, how such chemistry may occur, and trying to understand the role that architecture and spatial relationships must play, how these kind of spatial politics are actually lived through is something very delicate, and perhaps one can only learn from experience. I'm going to shift forward a little. Lev, do you have a question that you wanted to ask?
Well, it's a question, and maybe it'll be a helpful transition even, is I think that the question that comes up for me about that is also maybe the limitations of the architecture in a way. Somehow some of this modulation that you described has to be done by people, no? Some kind of presence in the building, some kind of programs that are implied or required, no? So sort of living system in combination to the structure. And so somehow modulating our expectations of what can be achieved. And so I guess one is sort of a question for you two, and then I was going to bring up maybe the work that Antigone was involved in, because I think that's somehow all about those kind of questions. So I guess the question for you two was, how involved do you want to be? Or, like I understand you have a practice, you teach, you do other things. So somehow the level of presence or the kind of like continuing relationships with this project, how do you decide how much to be around as the architects? I'll let you answer that, and then I'll ask Antigone.
Yeah, if I could answer like you were saying, our possibilities as architects are limited, and I absolutely agree. I think we shouldn't overestimate ourselves, but we found out quite something. We learned a lot with these two projects now, and we learned also what Wenke was showing on the ground floor plan. I mean, we had to go very quick over it, and it doesn't look spectacular, the floor plan, but there's certain details that we found very important, like the circular circulation within the apartment. So the zoning from more common space to private, very private, the balcony thing and whatever. And it's true that what's going on in Berlin right now with the professionally built modular houses for refugees, if I would make a list, like out of 7 rules we found out that have to apply to an apartment with this focus on community, whether it's for refugees or not, for a good apartment, I would say at least 6 out of 7 rules they don't apply with these buildings. No balconies, no very dead end way of circulation. Mono use within the building, mono use within the borough. So I think your question is very good. Why have you been approached by like so much of the architectural audience, but not by the politics? And probably it's about it's something that we have to do ourselves, because I think there is little influence on architects, but we have certain influence, and we should use it.
Yeah, but a short sentence from my side. I think also in architectural praxis there will be a change hopefully in the next years, because many of the young architects, also in the university students, they deal with this role of architect, and here in Berlin we have already some kind of offices who didn't build something before it was not possible in a way, yeah, for us. Every architect has to build something, of course. So I think the younger generation is much more aware of many things, of discrimination, of biopolitics, of gender, and so on. And so I'm quite exciting about it, yeah. And hopefully we can get more a little bit another role to define more ourselves in terms of changing also society things. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and I guess that what I wanted to ask Antigone is sort of almost the reverse, no? Of you presented so much about a kind of a social structure, a living structure. Were there architects involved in some of the sort of sub-projects of Curing the Limbo? Were they helpful?
Yes, they were involved. So as I told you, the big advantage, I think, of Curing the Limbo was that there were, many different people involved. So everybody brought their point of view or, knowledge to the table. We had 2 architects. So, and if you remember how I described the project, there were, like 4 main pillars, let's say, of the project. And we had an architect, and each one of them had a head, a project manager, let's say. So 2 architects for 2 of the main pillars of the project. One of them was, of course, the housing facilitation unit. And the other one was the connection of refugees with civil society organizations. And I think they both, I think architects, have a very, I don't know, I'm not an architect, but from working with them, the fact that they know very well how to connect, the place where you live with the broader area, neighborhood, context. I don't know how to best define this, but I think that's a very, very big advantage of having architects in a group. They have a very broad sense of urban planning or neighborhood planning, and I think that was extremely useful in this project. That wasn't just how to do job counseling, which was very straightforward. Let's teach people how to build a CV and then get in touch with employers or university professors who taught language courses. It was very, very concrete services, let's say, but architects brought to the table, a broader sense of how do you build a sense of belonging in the city. And that was very useful in our project.
Antigone, thank you. That's really reassuring to hear. I'm sure my students who, I teach in an art school, all my students are socially motivated and also coming from every corner of the world. And so this question of agency and whether we can actually be useful is something that they strive towards. So that's really good to hear that architectural thinking, if not precisely the building of buildings, can be put to good use. I often think it's the coordination of elements and the sort of almost choreography of issues that we're potentially good at thinking about. I have a question. I have so many questions.
Sorry.
Please, no, please.
I just wanted to add that these were architects that were actually also in parallel working in their, less than usual during the project, but they did have their actual architecture job. They worked in offices. They did build buildings, but they also had a very big interest for public policy and for civil society initiatives and stuff like that. So it's something that they did in parallel, and I thought that was really great.
It is. There are other strands of conversation to have about labor and what gets rewarded as architectural work, but we'll save that for another day. I had many questions to ask you, Antigone, and thank you for giving us, a slight overview of what is really huge and complex project, socially speaking, culturally speaking. And I was struck particularly with the long-term intentions of the project, even to the point where the intentions are autonomy. right? Meaning that this question of, let's say, very structured or strategic planning of activities would hopefully one day kind of self-generate and just continue. So, but the project did end, right? And I wanted to ask you about that ending, whether, I mean, as I said, if the project is intending towards or kind of trending towards autonomy, then maybe that ending is planned and a positive thing. But also, I'm curious to know if any partners continued any parts, and yeah, how the project kind of evolved.
Yeah, that's a great question, because on the one hand, the whole idea of this project was to make people autonomous and not dependent on state services. Of course, to be quite honest with you, I mean, we had people that were at different speeds, let's say, within the program. So you had people who became very autonomous very quickly. And then others that just struggled, because they struggled to find a job, or they struggled to become autonomous. I mean, it was just very difficult for them. The city of Athens didn't continue the program. It was mainly a budget thing. I think it was mainly due to it's an expensive program. But anyway, you need to clearly have an intention, to have a policy on this issue, in order to have programs related to the to refugee integration. The University of Athens, they have a program dedicated to migrants and refugees learning languages. And the two INGOs, international non-governmental organizations that were in the project, that's what they do. I mean, they have programs for refugees and migrants. Many programs, many different programs. And I actually work for one of them right now. So I can tell you that it's it's the case. So yeah, I don't know if this answered your question. It's a sad thing that, pilots have to end without being continued. That's a very common thing in Greece, unfortunately. But I think there was so much, we all learned, even from, participating in the project and then being able to transfer this knowledge to our respective organizations or future, projects we're involved in.
Yeah, maybe we can come back to this point a little later, because I'm feeling like this issue of maintenance and of care that needs to be extended is something that is shared both in the concerns that Christoph and Wenke articulated, with respect to the Lovo House and how that might evolve, how that might kind of land in long term, but also of what's not being achieved in the refugee houses that might be being built by builders. So this question of kind of how maintenance can be something that is valued rather than, because it strikes me that the integration that both of your projects is seeking to add value both to the host and to the hosted. And so I wonder if we might be able to come back to these ideas of, let's say, sustainability, but in the sense of something that is sustained over time. Let me leave that with you, and maybe you can have questions to ask each other. And I'll come to, where are we? The third presentation. Alice, great to see the work of your students. And again, relating to that, as I've been with mine very intensely, also thinking about similar things. So a very on-the-ground question. How familiar were your students with these areas? And when I say familiar, I also kind of mean how at ease were they at kind of addressing these areas as a subject?
As you also were mentioning in your work with your students, many of them actually they are coming through from a family of immigrants. So it's the studio is very mixed and very rich in this sense. So some students definitely they were a bit more feeling a sense of awkwardness in the sense of taking videos or making interview, really doing the field work on the ground. And but I think it was pretty interesting, the result, because it was shifting the idea of, more to be an explorer, like studying architecture as an explorer rather than an inventor. So I think when they start understanding this shift, that we are more exploring, there is no kind of to invent big things. It's more like really urban exploration. They became more kind of light also in their sense of exploration, although of course the complexity of the topic and the complexity of our reality. So it was a good experiment, I think, also for myself. So yeah. And I also thought about the question, maybe the role of the architect that Christoph and Winke were mentioning. And I thought it was also translated into the cartography. And I think also in the building itself, that is not something that is finished. Once we finished one building, so we finish one cartography, that's it. We can move next project or next cartography, but it's something we have to take care of it after the construction. So I appreciate when Christoph was saying that he's going, I think, once a month to visit the building. And I think it's kind of this role of architect taking care of something after it's been finished. Is I hope also something the students have been learning through this process.
Well, let's see. We're saying these things on tape. I hope that post-occupancy evaluation and so on are things that become, valued parts of practice. And great that you're kind of having those discussions with the next generation of practitioners as well. I guess you've answered already a kind of question of the role, as in not improvers, not colonizers, not people coming with answers, but rather explorers. You mentioned in your presentation the word solidarity, and I wonder how that might have come about as the students started to act in this area. I was struck by your use of the term. Of course, it's an intention that we aspire to and call upon in various ways. But do the students and do you think that architectural practice or kind of spatial interventions can foster solidarity in some ways?
Well, it was based on the project, and we started with cartography that then informed their project. So it was kind of the first step to navigate this complex project, how a project could be solidar. And the team I was working with also was with other professors and a professor that are at the University of Montreal, Irina Latek, that she was the responsible of the course, but also professor in media art, and also architect and urban designer working in Montreal. And I think that kind of a pluridisciplinary approach informed the students to translate and trying to navigate into this kind of very complex field of different fields that are informing a project in a city of the future, the city with contemporary issues. So I think it was the basis of everything, and I hope it will lead them also in their future professional life.
I was looking at those quite beautiful annotated maps that you were showing, and they're really showing not only, let's say, practical annotations, but also some engagement on a level of political and emotional nature with the place. And so you can start to see that building. I noticed a cab on the left-hand side of one of the images, and all power to the students to navigate exactly what qualities of space they're acting on. I wonder, there's a question in the chat that came through about specific repurposing of veteran housing as refugee housing. And I wonder if you could speak to maybe some examples in Montreal, like this kind of repurposing. Is it a viable strategy?
Well, yes, could be. Yes, there was a question about reconverting existing buildings. So I think that's a good point that was mentioning also during the presentations, how we can reconvert existing infrastructure. Probably Montreal doesn't have the problem of Athens, which is over-densified and we have space still, but probably not for so long because the economy is booming and we see all the kind of very global project coming in Montreal and a very kind of monocultural condominium project. So I think it's very good to think about how to reconvert existing infrastructure, and we have many. So that's very good point that is happening here.
Indeed, I think when you say monocultural, I immediately think of, let's say, the culture of the contract, the culture of the construction industry, and the culture of what decides what gets built. That is the thing that is rather monotheistic at the moment. But that the culture of architectural discourse hopefully remains fertile so that we can resist that. So speaking of fertile ground and so on, I'm going to move to Yaseman. Related very hard to your project. As my origins are in Bengal, which is also the southern fringes of Bengal are a mangrove, and what is now part of Bangladesh is deeply entrenched in a lot of spatial politics because of its capacity to resist climate change and extreme climate weather. The mangrove is an incredible ecosystem, but also because for political reasons, as well as ecological ones. I think in my context, in the Sundarbans in Bengal, tigers have many more rights than humans. And this is by design, because that is a borderland. And it's efficient, let's say, to prioritize the needs of the tiger rather than the needs of migrants crossing either way, or communities who have been immigrants for a long time, perhaps far longer than partition and so on. So sorry, I'm putting too much of myself in here, but I was struck by the fact that you're dealing with this very, very kind of rich context. And I suppose my question is, in dealing with all the stakeholders, human and non-human, how does one decide which interest to prioritize and whose interests you can work on as the architect?
Yes, thank you for the question. Of course, I really appreciated that you were kind of bringing all these layers that maybe, I didn't talk about all of them, right? I really talk much about the politics, and I think there's a reason for that. And it's kind of maybe about this idea of, I think, too much bringing those political stories to the front keeps us away from maybe like dealing with the actual problems, right? So, I mean, for example, you're asking about the priority, right? When we are talking about the environment, I don't think there's much to ask, right? It's okay. It's if it's about environmental sustainability, or what would we need, in 50 years, in 100 years, and what's sustaining a community. I don't think it's hard to find what is the priority. What's harder is how to maybe convince the stakeholders, right, that this is the priority and this is something that we should focus on and go for, because it doesn't seem urgent at all, right? Like, or even if it doesn't seem urgent until something happens, right? And I think that's common in everywhere in the world. So I think that there could be this by design, right? You're saying, by design, there are things that happen, right? So by design, there could be this shift of maybe interest of if the interest in environmental thinking, community-based environmental thinking, can also be a tool for economic empowerment, can also be something that, if it's about tourism, for example, we can't ideally, we wouldn't want anybody to go to a place like this, right? To keep it intact. But if we can't really do that, so can we look for solutions that are step by step, right? Not thinking about very holistic, solutions that are solving things forever, but really maybe day by day. Even if we extend the life of the forest for one more day, for example, I think there is a lot of value to that. So, and I think that idea of care that has been discussed a couple of times in different presentations is a very important one, like how architecture could be maybe about caregiving or finding ways for bringing that care to the thinking process. I don't know if that's a good answer, but maybe more opening the discussion to kind of like more questions, right?
Completely. I actually love, and I'm going to keep the image of this, let's make small handshakes if that's what we can do. Then let's make small handshakes, and these questions of integration and maintenance will form as those enduring handshakes. No? So I think it's a really beautiful approach that you put forward. Thank you so much. Lev, did you have a question for Yasemin?
I did. And that's a very nice transition, because we're talking about handshakes and sort of greetings. Because the title of this series, and what we've been talking about a lot, is about offering those who will come, something. And in the projects that you mentioned, Yasemin, somehow it was more you arriving there. You were the one who came. And so I'm curious, sort of, how you position yourself in relation to these communities, sort of how you introduce yourself, how you begin.
Yeah, I think, maybe at the beginning of the presentation, I was kind of going for this idea of sharing, or global, local, global, that I think there's a lot to talk about there, especially when we, think about a foreign architect or a architect coming from somewhere else, right? Whether from that place or being away and coming back, going to a place and doing something. And many times it happens in the kind of context of global north versus global south there, or the so-called global south. So there's, I think, this ideas of what kind of narratives we are working with, this idea of exotic thinking or colonial design, right? So, which is not one-sided. It doesn't come from just the architect coming from the other place, bringing the idea. It also is asked for, right, in the context. So the context that you will be working with would want that, because they would think that that idea is something that can push them move forward. So what I'm learning and what I have discovered, maybe challenging myself as an immigrant to work with this idea of how can we not colonize, even as immigrant that kind of goes back to do something in the place that they come from, or places that I don't come from, but I can make connections with locals in a way that this sharing can happen. I think it's, at the end, it's about how it could happen in a way that the project that I'm working on in the US or Iran or in Canada, they could all be approached with a similar lens, that you're trying to go and observe and learn and form the community and find the stakeholders, and maybe like what all the projects that we have heard about today are trying to do. So I think eventually we are kind of pushing for that, right? There would be a day that we don't need to think about which place this is happening, right? Like the kind of like not having all of these political things influencing our decision making. So this is more, I think, for me as a practitioner or many similar architects, it's like a practice of learning of how this could happen again in very maybe patient steps.
Thank you. Again, very poetically answered. Thank you so much. I wonder if you have any questions for each other. We could return to this theme of duration or maintenance or caregiving if you like, or perhaps there are issues around, this capacity to welcome that you feel we haven't talked about so far. We have a little bit of time if you have any things that you'd like to bring up. Or I can refer to my bag of questions. Certainly, Yaseman, what you were talking about in terms of the exploratory, and this seemed to chime with what Alice was talking about in terms of how her students were coming to a place with a degree of humility, with a degree of wishing to learn and recognize different textures of space, different forms of occupation, different durations, and different, ways of navigating, or even different borders, not necessarily the borders that are formed by geopolitical forces, but other kinds of borders and other kinds of barriers. Indeed, I do think that the capacity of spatial interventions to trouble those borders is precisely what binds all of these projects. And I have to say, personally speaking, it's so good to hear, the optimism and the agency that you've all kind of demonstrated in these projects. Lev, I wonder if there are any burning questions from our list that you feel that we ought to pick up.
May I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Please.
So I have a question to the mapping project, Alicia. Is there was it just a 1 or 2 semester thing, or is it is there a series, and is there a next step? Is there going to be another studio probably working on the base of the findings, to say so?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a 1-year project. So we start with 4 months of cartography and visual analysis. And then 6 months is the thesis, the final thesis for the students. And with a field trip to Berlin. So they've been to Berlin to see some of the project in Berlin. So next year we have to visit your project. No, very soon. So basically we are. This is the 2nd year. So I just started a few weeks ago in the beginning of the year, and the students are really now start to using the GIS and kind of very traditional tools. So it's a methodology is more or less the same. Of course, there's going to be an impact of the previous work. So, but at the same time, the students are very free to tackle their own topics. So they've been informed by the previous cartography, but it's really up to them to imagine their own field work, their own cartography, and then to have their final project. So this is the kind of the path that they're gonna go through.
I think I might also build on that, because it was a similar question that I would ask Alice. There's kind of cumulative value being produced by the studio. In my experience, Samaya has been teaching a version of the Hijra brief in South Africa for a couple of years. Their site, let's say a conceptual site, was in Morocco, and our site is in Jeddah. So it's not that there's the same body of knowledge being built, but there's a methodology that is being accumulated, which so it's not necessarily knowledge about the same site, but it's a sort of bank of approaches that spatial practitioners, would-be architects, and some of them qualified architects, are taking forward in terms of how to practice and how to translate these kind of many desires and praxis into a spatial intention that can actually happen. As Yaseman was saying, that ideally, I mean, we make a lot of speculations in academia, but the kind of small handshakes and the gritty work that needs to be done at the level of, let's say, soil remediation or providing a certain service, these kinds of methodologies are what we're kind of hoping to build.
Yes, I totally agree. There is a kind of methodology that, especially for education, but I see also the project of Christophe and Wenke, there is a kind of methodology in your first project that you are applying and trying to translate in a further project, which I think is very valuable to pursue.
And maybe that's also a question that I had, well, not really a question, but a sort of reflection that I had listening to Antigone. I mean, this project, yes, it was a pilot and therefore it's bookended. No, it has a beginning and an end, but that makes it such a valuable capsule of an experiment to kind of draw from. And I wonder, I mean, my hope is that the learnings from that experiment are accessible and accessible to many different disciplines. I think one of the issues with architecture is that we tend to be quite self-referential, and we often allow the industry to constrain our discussion. And just thinking about the breadth of your project, Antigone, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how is that documented? What is the potential for learning from it if one isn't actively involved in it like yourself?
Well, I mean, we do have the lessons learned in a booklet that was published and shared on internet, and I would love to share with you. I don't know where I should do this, but you'll let me know. You'd be surprised. I think not only architects, everyone is. It was very clear in this project that people come with their background, and it's very difficult for them to see how other experts or other fields think about how to work with the city, and that's what was interesting about it. The interaction, the interaction of all these different disciplines. I mean, can you imagine having at a table a university professor and an architect and public policy expert and people from that are psychologists? I mean, just to give you an example, and to have to decide together on how to approach the issue or to find a solution together. We do have all the, I mean, every pillar of the project had its own learnings and conclusions and lessons shared, and everything is available on the website. The question of language, I see, I don't know who wrote this. Could you be more specific? Do you mean if we can, if they're accessible? They're not in Greek, they're in English.
No. I think when we were thinking about this question of language, it was, and first of all, thank you for the reflection. And I think this is kind of by way of an answer of explaining that comment. These kind of forums in which multiple disciplines can get together and reflect seems like it's incredibly valuable. It's the most inspirational kind of spectrum that you just portrayed of people around the table, and it's these kinds of opportunities for knowledge sharing and perhaps critical cooperation that seem to be a really powerful way forward. And I suppose when we were talking about the question of language, it was a sort of disciplinary or professional language, which sometimes hampers those kinds of collaborations. I wonder if you have any examples of that or experience of that you want to bring forward.
I'm not sure I want to share. Sorry for misinterpreting the comment before.
Not at all.
Because I don't want to offend anyone, but I guess, the way is, so I mean, if you're in a classroom and you're the professor and everybody has wants to hear what you're saying, it's very different thing than being like a psychologist. And I'm not sure I have a very concrete example, but it's just, it's the difficulty of it was also the beauty of it. And I think all disciplines are necessary for this really, you know, complex social issues. You really need a, you know, I mean, I'm not saying you have to have 100 people around the table, but to definitely bring different perspectives enriches the result.
For sure. And I think all of you have spoken about, you know, the ways in which your projects or your work generally has extended into collaborations with people that were either, you know, on a local or global kind of basis, or whether you're talking about cooperation across university departments or between academia and the public, or indeed in the intersectional examples, and also the kind of city government versus practitioner examples that Christoph and Wenke brought forward. This has been a really rich conversation. I wonder if you're at capacity, and also if we are at time. Lev, can you?
We are, and I'm very happy to contribute so in the direction of a conclusion. But I mean, first, I want to thank all of you so much for a really generous discussion and your presentations. And I think that there's a kind of inspiring range of positions and approaches that I'm very glad found a common language. That also share a sort of humility, but maybe most importantly, a kind of a desire to act with care. And maybe to kind of reflect on the ambition of this series and today's event, which was never really about providing answers, but more, I think, of asking questions together and demonstrating that some of the assumptions we might have about the proper limits of somehow architectural attention or architectural action, agency, as came up. These have never been fixed, right? They've always been contested, and the people contesting them are not only architects. So we were talking earlier how everything can't be represented. Every problem does not need an architectural intervention. And the contribution of architecture varies and should vary widely in different kind of contexts and different times. This is all very good, and I think we should be willing to embrace it, willing to kind of question norms of how we practice, what roles and responsibilities we take on, and the ones that we refuse. To act as kind of consciously as possible if we want to act as helpfully as possible. So. To the public, I just invite you to continue and watch the videos that were just published, and to you, Shumi and Wenke and Christoph, Yaseman, Alice and Tikini, just huge thanks and gratitude for your generosity. Also to your collaborators, and especially the students whose work was presented today, the CCA production team, and especially Sholian Kote, Iro Kalagiru, and Alexandra Lin for an enormous work behind the scenes. So thank you, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of whatever time of day it is.